In our discussions today, we will be highlighting the process of evolution of political theories through many centuries, starting as early as from 5th century before Christ and down to the present day. Now, just to recap a bit, political theories in the form of a coherent body of ideas about politics of a particular time and place, or about politics which transcends such limitations, have existed since the classical age, or even you can talk about the times of antiquity. Plato's theory of communism, which appeared about 5th century BC, or of justice, or slightly later than that, Aristotle's theory of state, may be taken as examples to the point. Let's start with an observation made by Sheldon S. Olin. Olin notes, I quote, "The classic form of political theory took shape in 5th century Athens and was largely the works of Socrates and his circle. This achievement was consolidated by Plato and Aristotle, and it involved primarily an attempt to forge a synthesis of three elements: politics, the idea of a theory, and the practice of philosophy." Unquote. This pithy observation of Olin tells us about the constituent elements of a political theory as it was in this period of formation, which are politics, the idea of a theory, and the practice of philosophy. Now, politics referred to all that was connected with matters of public concern, and thus different from what is essentially one's own, essentially one's private. This connotation of politics came particularly from its linguistic linkage with the Greek root words like polis, it meant city-state; politia meant constitution; polites meant citizens; and politicos meant statesmen, all of which had some sense of being public and not private. Perhaps this distinction between public and private anticipated what somewhat later, much later, John Stuart Mill differentiated between self-regarding and other-regarding actions, and which we now refer to as public space and private space. So, in today's terminology, the classical meaning of politics referred to the public space only and not to the private space. The theory, the connotation of the theory too, derived from the Greek root word theoria, and I've talked about it in detail in the last session. And theoria and some other words connected with it meant basically observations, observing, the observer, or the methods of observation, and also drawing inference from what is observed. The third element of this synthesis, philosophy, meant two things. One, it provided a direction to the methodology of acquiring knowledge, that is, how and in which way knowledge should be acquired or culled from other sources. And also it referred to a pursuit of wisdom, of knowledge that would help one to become wiser. So here, philosophy had a twofold objective: acquiring knowledge and making people who are acquiring knowledge wiser. Wisdom and knowledge both were the objectives of philosophy. So, as a whole, political theory tried to discuss politics through, as far as possible, empirical observation, whose aim was not just acquiring knowledge, not just broadening one's knowledge horizon, at the same time to make oneself wiser while dealing with matters of public concern. Thus began political theory in the classical age. It went for many centuries, right up to 16th or 17th centuries. This classical tradition prevailed. It would be wrong if I stop at that point to say when classical tradition prevailed, it's still there, but not the predominant line of thinking. But even if a classical theory could satisfy all these three constituent elements and criterion, it was not free from challenges. We found Aristotle, Plato's most favored student, challenging Plato himself. So every theorist was not free from challenge. He was challenged by later theorists. Why? The challenge came against how the knowledge is acquired, the methodology, on what knowledge was acquired as object of inquiry, and also the challenge came from a change in the real world of politics. And that's how new theories appeared. That's how Plato's theory of communism was severely challenged by Aristotle. That's how the theories of Middle Age, ecclesiastical theories of Middle Age were challenged later by thinkers like Machiavelli. And many times, theories change due to a change of time and space. If we just take one example, the example of social contract theory, a very well-known example in that sense. The first to appear, the theory first appeared in 1651 publication of Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, an Englishman. So Hobbes was trying to explain to us how state was formed, and he, belonging to his time and his place, an England of mercantile activities, referred to the importance of contract being the foundation stone of a state power, and introduced also the idea of state of nature as an analytical starting point of the contract. And he portrayed a very dark picture of the state of nature, in a nutshell, of a life which was totally unacceptable, and people living the life, they had to live the life, and through contract they formed a state power. Next to Hobbes came Locke, also an Englishman, some decades later, and Locke was published in 1690, just about 40 years later. And Locke had a totally different idea of social contract. And he had a totally different idea of state of nature itself also. His state of nature was not so much gloomy, not so much dark, not so much unbearable. And he also introduced the idea of a limited government. Now, one always asks the question that if both of them belong to the social contract school of thinking, if both of them belong to the same country, speaking and writing in the same language, then why the difference? The difference was in the political situation of the time. When Hobbes wrote, there was an autocracy of Charles I. And when Locke wrote, some kind of a limited democratic system was introduced in England. So that perhaps explains the differences in perspectives of Hobbes and Locke. And a totally different perspective was presented by the third thinker of social contract school, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France. And there one can argue that the country itself changed from England to France, not just the time changed, but the country was also different. So that's how theories appeared in succession, theories in the same age, in the same country, or theories in different ages in different countries. But that does not mean that each was unique in itself. They were unique. Of course, they were unique. They had their special characteristics. That doesn't mean that we got a succession of theories discrete in their nature, unconnected, unrelated to each other, as if some loosely scattered flowers of many hues, but no garland. But it's not so. We can, if we read carefully, discern a running thread of common characteristics among all these theories, which are collectively known as the classical political theory, the traditional political theory, or political thinking of the classical age. Now, we can discern three basic characteristics of what is known as classical political theory. It's actually a collection of many theories appearing in many points of time and in many places. The first characteristic was that the basic motive that guided classic or traditional political theory was therapeutic and not intellectual. It's therapeutic in the sense that almost all, or perhaps all of them, prescribed some desired course of action. They detected some kind of a sickness, some kind of a malady, some kind of weakness in the politics at the time, and they amassed facts about them, and they also prescribed what should be done to correct the wrongs, to right the wrongs, so that the political community can live a better collective life. In that sense, it was therapeutic, as if a doctor, after finding out the causes which is causing distress to his patient, prescribes a course of medicine. The second characteristic was that they are often urged on by a quest for the best form of political system, the best form. They called it the ideal state, or the ideal form, whatever it may be, or the best kind of rule. In so doing, they are guided solely by normative considerations. Even Aristotle, who due to his scientific training of early age was quite a bit of an empirical thinker, unexpected from his age, and he collected facts, concrete facts, and at the end he also wrote something which is totally idealistic. So basically, even if they dealt with empirically collected facts, empirically verifiable facts, ultimately they ended with some kind of a conception about what is ideal and what should be done to achieve that ideal. And thirdly, perhaps most importantly, which differentiates traditional political theory from what we call the modern or scientific or empirical political theory, which came later on, was that traditional political theory always tried to make the real world of politics to be an embodiment of their theory. That I think needs a bit of an explanation. That they had a real world before them, they were living in a real world of politics, they are not liking them for some reason or other, or maybe there was something wrong with that real world of politics, but they built up a theory and they wanted to transform, change the real world according to their theories, as if a thinker or a political theorist was a sculptor who was working with clay, working with stone, and could sculpt an image out of it, whatever image he wanted. But reality is not so easily changeable. It may not be changeable at all. was an idea which escaped them. So, we have come to a stage when we are trying to reach the summation of our findings about classical political theory. And once again, you can turn to another piece of brilliant writing by Sheldon Olin. Olin, in summing up classical theory, commented that, I quote, "Successful action must be preceded by knowledge which simultaneously explain things as they were and things as they should be." Now, that's the entire essence of classical political theory. That classical political theory was not just bent on, not just motivated by finding things that are actually in the real world. And they also stated what they should be like. And this is the basic nature. If we start from Plato, Aristotle, think of the Middle Age like John of Salisbury, St. Augustine, Marsilio Padua, come down to Boda, Machiavelli, later thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. In all of them, we find that they're ending their observations with something which, according to them, should be done. Should be done either by the rulers themselves or by the people themselves. Now, this is the basic nature of classical political theory, and that's where its problem starts. One of its problem starts. That when a political thinker is talking about what should be done or what ought to be done, he is bringing in his own subjectivity here. And that subjectivity colors the entire theory, the content of the entire theory. And it may not be acceptable to the subjectivity of a thinker who comes next. So it is a collection of subjective perceptions of the reality. They dealt with reality, no doubt about that, but when they looked at the reality, each of them had put on their own pair of spectacles of their own subjective perceptions, and came out with their versions of reality. And that's why there is a problem with the classical political theory in that sense. With a hindsight of coming later, we can now try to find out what really plagued modern classical political theory or traditional political theory, what really led to the search for alternatives, the search for what we collectively label as modern or empirical or non-traditional political theories or non-traditional alternatives. There's no doubt we should be totally blind to history if we just debunk classical theories for being classical, for being old, for being ancient. Because most of the concepts we use today have been developed in the classical age. Only one example would suffice: democracy. We can't stop talking about democracy today. Even peoples of Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, they have just talked about democracy in the very recent times. And think of it, Plato and Aristotle, they are also talking about democracy in 5th or 4th century before Christ. So most of the rich vocabulary we have inherited from the classical times. Quite a few important insights we have inherited from the classical times. But still, they had their limitations. We can identify a few of them. First of all, they're basically idiographic, in the sense that they dealt with the unique nature of a single case, or even a single political unit. Both Plato and Aristotle were basically concerned with the state of polity available in Athens of their time, and from that they tried to universalize their experience into their own political theories. Secondly, since each of them was dealing with a specific time and a specific place, uh, a common vocabulary was often difficult to find, or even common connotation of the same word, the same expression was not there. Thirdly, it is highly subjective. I've told that before. That each one of them was looking at reality with his own eyes, his own perceptions. Naturally, it's not acceptable to those who are coming later. Fourthly, in classical theory, the individual was not there. There might have been individuals who had some larger than life size existence, but the common people, masses, individuals, core individuals, they were not there at all. There were ideas, there were institutions, there was constitution, there's even important lawgivers or rulers, prince in Machiavelli's word, but the people was not there. Significance was attached either to the political community or to political institutions or to some authoritative political ruler. Fifth, Aristotle wrote, I quote here, and you understand why I quote here now, a bit later. I quote, the male is naturally more fitted to command than the female, except when there is a miscarriage of nature. Unquote. Perhaps in keeping with this belief, women, the other half of human population, never got any worthwhile mention in traditional political theory. And finally, almost the entire body of traditional political theory considered politics to be an entirely autonomous activity, separate and apart from the society. They could not think of any possible linkage between politics and the society at large, any possible movement of ideas and individuals between society and politics, or in either one way or two-way movement. So it was a body of theoretical ideas totally delinked from its social context. This net consequence of all this was that despite the very richness of his ideas, the very richness of his vocabulary, the unique insight of many of the classical political thinkers, classical political thinking, classical political philosophy on which the traditional political science was built up, never got much of a respect in the academic circle. That can always be understandable, that politics as a separate discipline has appeared much, much later as considered or as compared to history or economics or philosophy, even in Western universities. So out of that kind of disappointment, or that kind of frustration, or even expectation that something should be done about it, some improvements should be done about it, came somewhat later an attempt to change the nature of political theory or to offer alternative visions of political theories